Okay, let's unpack this incredible timeline. Today, we've been handed, well, a colossal chronicle, really. It's a journey tracing the sheer scope of the Eastern Slavic world over more than 1,000 years.
Yeah, it's huge.
We're moving from the medieval origins through the Tsarist expansion across the seismic shock of the Soviet century and landing squarely in the geopolitical landscape of the modern Russian Federation. It's a lot.
That's absolutely right. And our mission here really is to condense a millennium marked by almost continuous struggle and immense, often quite brutal, centralization of power.
Right.
We'll trace the key moments, the early foundations of Russes, the immense driven empire-building projects of figures like Peter and Catherine the Great, the big names. Then the violent birth and eventual collapse of the USSR and the emergence of the current political system. This is a history where the past isn't just like a foundation, it's an active, ongoing force.
And that persistence is exactly why you, our listener, need this context. Understanding this deeply complex and, let's be honest, often contradictory history is essential.
Absolutely.
It's not merely an academic exercise. It's the necessary shortcut to making sense of contemporary world events. We're going to trace these patterns and try to figure out why certain historical responses, like, say, reliance on centralized power or suspicion of the West, have become so baked into the political culture. Let's begin at the beginning. Kievan Rus, the earliest foundation of the Eastern Slavic state. Our sources detail a state that, for all its promise, was ultimately torn apart by internal conflict.
Yeah, it was fundamentally a collective governance structure, but it failed because of relentless infighting among the ruling princely family, just constant squabbling.
Okay.
This internal strife really eroded Kiev's central dominance, and it allowed powerful regional centers like Vladimir Suzdal in the northeast and Halych-Volhynia in the southwest to, well, gain prominence.
Right.
The final death blow to Kiev as a major center came in the 13th century with the Mongol Golden Horde conquest. Kiev was famously destroyed, just flattened, and never really fully recovered its preeminence.
But the identity of the Russian nation, it had to find a new center after that destruction. So where did it successfully reestablish itself?
Well, the essential foundation for the modern Russian nation, it kind of coalesced around two key areas. First, you have Vladimir Suzdal, which survived, but under the heavy, long-term yoke of Mongol domination, a tough existence. And second, there was the independent Novgorod Republic up in the north. Now, Novgorod is fascinating because it largely escaped direct Mongol occupation.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, and it managed to flourish economically. It kept strong ties with Europe, growing wealthy in the orbit of the Hanseatic League. So you see this dual legacy right from the start, sort of authoritarian influence from the east and commercial ties from the west. It's always there in Russian history.
This early history also brings up that thorny issue, the Normanist controversy, the debate over who the Rus actually were. This isn't just dry academic history, is it? It often gets used as a political tool today.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's historically and politically highly charged, even now. The Normanist theory, which suggests the founding elites were Norse, Scandinavian Varangians, was pushed heavily by German scholars back in the 18th century.
Right.
And that immediately attracted criticism. Anti-Normanist historians questioned the reliability of the main source, the primary chronicle, pointing out it was written much later, early 12th century, and there are variations. The argument against it often focuses on minimizing any foreign influence on how the state first got going.
Yet if we look outside the Russian-centric chronicles, the evidence for a Scandinavian origin seems pretty robust, doesn't it?
Yes, and here's where it gets really interesting. You look at Arabic sources from the 9th and 10th centuries, and they strongly support the Scandinavian origin. These writers explicitly identified the Varangians with Swedes. They placed the Russes as already established up at the headwaters of the Volga River before 859 CE, mainly focused on trade. And the primary chronicle itself, despite being compiled later, it also specifies that the Varangians who migrated were exclusively Scandinavian Swedes, Gotlanders.
So it reinforces that idea.
It does. It reinforces the idea that the core military and ruling caste were these Norse adventurers. Now, this doesn't mean the Slavs didn't form the bulk of the population or the culture, but the initial rulers, and maybe even the name Russes, likely derived from this Norse elite.
So while the origins of the Russes might be Norse, the true cultural and political foundation of the state needed something deeper than just trade and warfare. It needed the conversion to Eastern Orthodoxy.
Correct. That decision irrevocably cemented Russ's cultural and spiritual identity. It permanently oriented it toward Constantinople and, crucially, away from Catholic Western Europe.
And it started started with Regent Olga of Kiev.
It did. She visited Constantinople, maybe 945, maybe 957. The dates are a bit fuzzy, and she was baptized there. And the story of her political savvy is just legendary. Well, to avoid being forced into marriage with the aging Emperor Constantine VII, she apparently convinced him to be her godfather.
Clever.
Very. Then she declared it would be totally inappropriate for a godfather to marry his goddaughter. Checkmate.
That's some next-level diplomatic chess.
Yeah.
But her son, Sviatoslav, he wasn't exactly impressed by Christian maneuvering.
Not at all. Sviatoslav, ruling from about 963 to 972, he remained a very stubborn pagan. A warrior, first and foremost, worshipped Perun, the thunder god.
Right.
The primary chronicle emphasizes that he feared converting because his warriors, his drushina, would lose respect for him. They'd mock him.
Ah, the warrior ethos.
Exactly. It shows that delicate balance rulers had to strike between spiritual alignment and keeping the loyalty of the military elite. That's a theme that just repeats and repeats throughout Russian history.
Okay, moving forward then. The fragmentation eventually gives way to the consolidation of Tsarist power, starting decisively with Ivan the Terrible.
Yeah, Ivan IV, he formalized the transition. He transformed the Grand Duchy of Russia into the Tsardom of Russia in 1547. And he wasn't just changing titles, he systematically crushed the power of the high nobility, the boyars.
Right, establishing that autocracy.
Precisely. A highly centralized autocratic model where power flowed only from the Tsar. His death and then his son Fyodor's death without an heir plunged the country into chaos. The time of troubles, famine, civil war, foreign invasion, the works.
And the chaos only really ended with the start of the Romanov dynasty.
The Romanovs took over in 1613, and the expansion that followed was just staggering. By the end of the 17th century, Russia had pushed all the way through Siberia, reaching the Pacific Ocean.
Incredible scale.
Empire building on an unprecedented scale, absorbing dozens of different peoples, vast territories. But, and this is key, this expansion brought immense pressure on the peasantry and the outlying regions, which led to major internal uprisings, like the revolt led by the Cossack Stenker Razin around 1670, 1671.
So the pattern is clear. Expansion goes hand in hand with internal repression.
It's intrinsically linked.
Yes. Now, the pace of change and Russia's relationship with Europe really kicked into high gear with Peter the Great. He didn't just want to modernize. He wanted to physically transform Russia into a European power, even moving the capital.
Peter was arguably the most transformative figure in Russian history before maybe Lenin. After the Great Northern War, he renamed the state the Russian Empire in 1721 and established St. Petersburg as the new capital physically and symbolically facing west.
And his drive for Westernization was deeply personal, wasn't it? He went abroad himself.
Oh, yeah. He spent 4 months personally studying shipbuilding in Zaandam and Amsterdam. He even worked anonymously at a Dutch East India Company shipyard, just like a regular worker.
Wow.
He used this first-hand knowledge to build Russia's first modern navy. But this move came at a staggering human cost. Building St. Petersburg required forced conscription of tens of thousands of serfs and state peasants. Many died from disease and just brutal conditions.
So the Westernization project was often brutally imposed.
Very much so. He was proclaimed Emperor of all Russia in 1721, and his legacy was, well, ably carried on by Catherine the Great later on.
Right.
Catherine continued Peter's efforts. She oversaw more territorial expansion, especially southward down to the Black Sea, and ushered in the era of the Russian Enlightenment. French and German ideas filtered into the court.
But selectively.
Very selectively, yes, because the core structure of serfdom and autocracy remained firmly in place.
Okay, so all this empire building, expansion, modernization, eventually it runs headlong into the greatest military force of the age, Napoleon.
Right. The 19th century opens with this monumental crisis in defense. Alexander Arada repulsed Napoleon's massive invasion in 1812, and that event instantly established Russia as a dominant great European power.
But the invasion itself was an unimaginable catastrophe for Napoleon's Grande Armée. The numbers are just mind-boggling.
They really are. Of the 450,000 troops that entered Russia, sources suggest something like 85% to 90% perished, just wiped out.
That casualty rate is staggering. If it wasn't just pitched battles, how did Russia manage such a devastating defense?
It was a brutal combination of Well, climate and strategy. The Russian military used systematic scorched earth tactics. They destroyed crops, food supplies, everything as they retreated.
Denying Napoleon resource.
Exactly, denying him the ability to forage or live off the land. This strategy, combined with rampant disease, starvation, and then the onset of the bitter Russian winter, it just decimated the French forces long before any truly decisive battles could happen.
So the strategic brilliance was refusing major engagement until the French were exhausted.
Precisely, until they were already weakened and diminished.
Yet this triumphant victory, it seems it temporarily masked some profound internal weaknesses that became undeniable just a few decades later.
Oh, absolutely. The Crimean War in 1856 laid bare Russia's technological and organizational backwardness compared to Western powers like Britain and France. It was a shock.
And it forced change.
It did. In response, Alexander II abolished serfdom in 1861, a titanic reform, liberating millions of peasants. It was followed by significant legal and military reforms aimed at alleviating the country's backwardness. But, and this is the crucial but, the Tsar preserved the core concept of autocracy.
Right.
And under his successors, particularly the last Tsar, Nicholas II, this preservation of absolute power, combined with incomplete economic and social modernization, well, basically guaranteed further unrest was coming.
So the internal pressures we just talked about, autocracy bumping up against incomplete industrialization and this vast, discontented peasantry, it all came to a head in the early 20th century, really setting the stage for the collapse of Tsarism.
Yeah, by the beginning of the 1900s, Russia was basically a ticking time bomb. It was in deep political and economic crisis. You had a rapidly growing industrial working class demanding a better life, supported by a radicalized intelligentsia pushing revolutionary ideas, everything from Marxist socialism to anarchism, and the first major eruption was the 1905 revolution.
Right, 1905. That revolution forced Nicholas II to make the first real cracks in the absolute monarchy, didn't it?
He was forced to, yes. After massive unrest strikes, mutinies, Nicholas II reluctantly issued the October Manifesto. It promised civil liberties and, crucially, created a national legislature, the Duma.
A big step, seemingly.
It seemed like it, and it did satisfy moderate groups, the liberals, some industrialists, who felt they'd maybe achieved a form of constitutional rule. But the radical socialists, they rejected these concessions entirely. They demanded fundamental land reform, an end to the wars they saw coming, and the complete overthrow of the regime. For them, the Duma was just window dressing. The revolutionary currents had now become permanent, organized forces.
The moment of ultimate breakdown, though, the real tipping point, was World War I.
The war acted as the ultimate catalyst, no question.
Right.
Initially, there was the surge of national unity, patriotism, which briefly quieted the strikes. But as the war dragged on, bringing just staggering military losses, economic chaos, supply chains collapsing, that fragile patriotism just vanished. And Nicholas II's decision to take personal command of the army in 1915, militarily disastrous and politically fatal.
Because he left Empress Alexandra in charge.
Exactly. He left her in charge of the imperial government back in Petrograd. And the court, already viewed with suspicion, was further undermined by the pervasive influence of Grigory Rasputin, that self-proclaimed mystic. It just fueled rampant reports of incompetence and corruption right at the top.
So by early 1917, the country simply couldn't function anymore? It was falling apart?
The end came incredibly quickly. Protests over food shortages spiraled into massive worker strikes in Petrograd. Crucially, the Tsar's own military garrison refused orders to suppress the demonstrations.
The troops wouldn't fire.
Right. That forced him to abdicate in February 1917. 3 centuries of Romanov rule, just gone. A provisional government was formed, but it immediately struggled. It couldn't reconcile the needs of the liberal elite with the demands of the radicalized workers' councils, the Soviets.
And the failure of that provisional government opened the door wide for Lenin and the Bolsheviks. Tell us about the October insurrection.
Well, the Bolsheviks seized power in November 1917, October, according to the old-style calendar they were still using, hence the name. They overthrew the provisional government, largely through a pretty well-organized coup, backed by armed worker militias and sympathetic soldiers in Petrograd.
And they immediately moved to consolidate power, ruthlessly.
Yeah, absolutely. They moved to suppress any form of democratic challenge. The National Constituent Assembly, which had actually been elected just weeks prior, arguably the only truly freely elected national body in Russian history,
Right.
was dissolved by Lenin's troops on its very first day in session, just shut down.
Why? Because it wasn't Bolshevik-dominated.
Precisely. It refused to become just a rubber stamp for Soviet power. It confirmed right from the start that the Bolshevik vision for governance was autocratic, non-pluralistic, No room for opposition.
Though with internal enemies temporarily neutralized, Lenin's next big task was getting Russia out of the devastating World War.
Yeah, and this led to the really painful Treaty of Brest-Litovsk in 1918. It was incredibly harsh, forced Russia to cede vast western borderlands to Germany and its allies.
Why sign something so damaging?
Lenin famously argued the nascent revolution simply could not survive a continued war effort. They needed peace at almost any price to consolidate power internally. However, when Germany was defeated by the Allies later that year, the Soviet government swiftly repudiated the treaty.
But they weren't safe yet.
Far from it. The Bolshevik grip on power immediately triggered the brutal Russian Civil War.
And this civil war, it wasn't just a simple red versus white fight, was it?
No, not at all. From 1918 until roughly 1921, the Bolsheviks were fighting for their very existence on multiple fronts. They fought the anti-Bolshevik white movement.
Right.
That was former Tsarist officers, monarchists, some liberals. They fought the socialist revolutionaries, who actually had massive peasant support in many areas. They fought various independent national groups trying to break away, and they even fought Allied expeditionary armies, British, French, American, Japanese, sent to support the anti-communists.
A chaotic free-for-all.
Absolutely. This whole era of conflict, known as war communism, was essential to cementing Bolshevik control through extreme measures. By 1921, they had defeated most internal enemies, securing control over the vast core of the former imperial territory.
With some exceptions.
Right, the major exceptions being Finland, the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, and the Moldavian Democratic Republic, which became part of Romania. They managed to stay independent.
Okay, so once the smoke cleared from the Civil War, the Soviet Union was formally established in 1922. But almost immediately, the leadership was thrust into a new kind of struggle, a power struggle.
The timing was just brutal for the Bolshevik old guard. Lenin suffered a series of debilitating strokes. They eventually rendered him speechless and politically paralyzed. The battle for succession was immediately underway, waged behind the scenes in the corridors of the newly centralized Communist Party bureaucracy.
And one man was, perhaps uniquely, positioned to win that fight, even though many contemporaries apparently dismissed him as just a dull administrator.
Stalin. Joseph Stalin. He was absolutely determined to come out on top. He'd been meticulously accumulating bureaucratic power for years, especially through his control of personnel appointments as the party's general secretary.
The levers of power.
Exactly. So when Vladimir Lenin died in January 1924, his funeral was this massive state-managed spectacle, a monstrous affair, as some sources describe it. Hundreds of thousands attended in 25 degrees below zero weather.
Wow.
This manufactured outpouring of grief created an immense political vacuum, and Stalin was perfectly prepared to fill it.
How is he plotting so successfully that his major rivals, like Trotsky, didn't really see it coming until it was too late?
He consolidated power with, well, incredible ingenuity, as one source puts it, primarily by exploiting his control over the party apparatus. He systematically isolated and removed rivals figures like Trotsky, Kamenev, Zinoviev, often by using the party's own internal rules against them, like the ban on factions.
And then the rules back on them.
Right. And by appointing his loyalists to key provincial and regional posts, building a base, his rivals, who were maybe still operating under the assumption of open political debate within the party, completely misjudged his bureaucratic ruthlessness. They underestimated the gray blur, as he was sometimes called.
Until it was too late.
Until it was far too late. And Lenin's great, tragically prescient fear was that Stalin would develop a personality cult, which of course became the singular, terrifying source of authority in the Soviet Union for decades to come.
Okay, so the period immediately following Lenin's death really defined the USSR. It was marked by Stalin's two massive, incredibly disruptive projects: state-led rapid industrialization and agricultural collectivization.
Yeah, the industrialization efforts focused on huge public works, heavy industry, steel mills, dams. It did generate some initial enthusiasm among certain party cadres and younger workers who believed in the project.
But that enthusiasm wasn't shared when it came to collectivization.
Not at all. It was fundamentally contrasted by minimal, often violent, opposition to agrarian collectivization. Peasants met the seizure of their land, their livestock, their grain with open resistance, sometimes burning crops or killing animals rather than hand them over.
What was the goal? Why force it?
The intent, officially, was to create large, efficient, state-controlled farms and, crucially, to finance industrialization by squeezing surplus value out of agriculture. But the reality, It led to catastrophic economic chaos and resistance.
And when these policies failed, leading to widespread famine, Stalin refused to accept any blame.
That refusal was the critical pivot point that justified the ensuing terror. He claimed the failure wasn't due to bad policy, but sabotage. Sabotage by moribund classes, kulaks, supposedly wealthy peasants, old bourgeois specialists, nationalists, who he claimed were actively trying to undermine socialism.
So failure becomes proof of enemies needing removal.
Exactly. His logic required even greater repression to cleanse the system of these internal enemies.
In this political framing, it turned policy failure directly into justification for targeted repression, leading most horrifically to the Great Famine.
The Great Famine of 1932-1933, often called the Holodomor in Ukraine, where it was particularly devastating but also hitting the Volga region, Kazakhstan, and others. It was a serious existential threat to the regime's stability.
But Stalin used it.
He used it ruthlessly. He applied punitive repression specifically against national and social groups deemed politically dangerous. In regions like Ukraine and the Kuban, the intense requisition of grain, which resulted in millions of deaths from starvation, directly overlapped with aggressive political repression aimed at reversing the relatively lenient nationality policies that had been in place since the early 20s.
So it became a tool of political control, not just economic policy.
Absolutely. It was weaponized.
And this, of course, accelerated into the Great Purges, or the Great Terror, where Stalin achieved basically an unrestricted personal dictatorship built on perpetual fear.
Yeah, the scale and even the core motivation for the purges are still debated among historians. Some view it primarily as extreme political infighting, a way to finally eliminate genuine ideological threats, like followers of Trotsky or Bukharin. They point to the targeting of specific factions.
Okay.
Others argue it was a permanent, necessary component of totalitarianism itself, relying on quotas for arrests and executions to maintain the system's paranoia and control, a sort of self-perpetuating terror machine.
But everyone agrees Stalin was the driving force.
Yes. All interpretations agree that Stalin's personal will, his paranoia, and his ambition were the principal catalysts. He arrested and executed millions, not just peasants or perceived saboteurs, but the very people who founded the Soviet state, the old Bolsheviks.
Let's put that political destruction into perspective. The numbers are chilling.
They are. The purge of the original revolutionary elite was almost absolute. Of the 6 original members of the 1920 Politburo who had survived Lenin, all were eventually purged and executed by Stalin. Every single one.
Incredible.
And the destruction of the Red Army High Command was similarly comprehensive. Thousands of experienced officers liquidated right before World War II. This had a profound long-term consequence. It created this massive generational gap.
How so?
It replaced the older elite with a younger, theoretically more loyal cohort. People promoted rapidly from the working class, party rank and file, young technicians. These promoted cadres, often known as the generation of 1937, formed the core Soviet elite right up until the early 1980s. They owed their careers entirely to Stalin.
It's just chilling that the creator of this system, Stalin himself, was apparently consumed by it psychologically in the end.
Our sources confirm that. Stalin grew relentlessly suspicious in his final years. He famously stated, "I trust no one, not even myself."
Wow.
The repression sowed this long-term, deep-seated distrust within society and the elite itself. And this atmosphere of psychological terror, it has political echoes even today.
How do we see that?
Well, studies have actually shown that communities that were more heavily repressed under Stalin, areas with higher arrest and execution rates, have measurably lower rates of political participation and voter turnout today, decades later, both in Russia and Ukraine. It suggests historical trauma can profoundly suppress civic engagement across generations.
Fascinating and sobering. Okay, turning to foreign policy during this period, Stalin viewed the rise of Hitler and Nazism with its explicit anti-communist rhetoric and that goal of Drang nach Osten, the push to the east, with, well, justified alarm.
Yeah, the ideological clash was immediate and obvious. The Soviets initially tried to foster collective security against fascism. They notably backed the Republican forces against German and Italian fascist intervention during the Spanish Civil War.
Right.
But the Soviet leadership watched anxiously as the geopolitical situation just deteriorated through the 30s. They felt increasingly isolated by the Western powers.
And the ultimate turning point in Soviet diplomacy came with what the Soviets viewed as the Western betrayal at Munich in 1938.
Precisely. The Soviet Union strongly opposed the Munich Agreement, where Britain and France appeased Hitler by letting him take the Sudeten land from Czechoslovakia. They saw it as the Western powers failing to oppose German expansionism and, worse, effectively encouraging Hitler to look east towards them.
So feeling abandoned.
Right. This sense of abandonment, combined with very practical strategic needs for breathing room, led the Soviets to carry out a stunningly opportunistic diplomatic maneuver, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact in August 1939.
The non-aggression pact with Nazi Germany.
Exactly, which included secret protocols dividing Eastern Europe, Poland, the Baltics, parts of Romania into German and Soviet spheres of influence. It shocked the world, especially communist parties elsewhere, but it granted Stalin temporary strategic breathing room, or so he thought.
That temporary pact came to a very abrupt end on June 22, 1941.
Operation Barbarossa. Germany broke the agreement and launched a massive invasion of the USSR, starting what Russia still calls the Great Patriotic War.
The initial German advance was devastatingly effective, wasn't it?
Incredibly so, pushing deep into Soviet territory, encircling huge armies. But the Red Army, despite staggering losses and the purges just years before, managed to halt the German momentum right at the gates of Moscow in late 1941. A crucial moment.
But the real turning point.
The true, definitive turning point of the war on the Eastern Front, however, was the Battle of Stalingrad. It raged from late 1942 into early 1943. This was a severe, catastrophic defeat for Germany. The entire Sixth Army lost. They couldn't really recover strategically or demographically after that blow.
And the sheer scale of the Eastern Front. It's often underappreciated in Western narratives, but it was absolutely key to the overall Allied victory.
It was decisive. There's no other word for it. Harry Hopkins, a close advisor to Roosevelt, noted in 1943 that the Russian front was tying down something like 200 German divisions. Compare that to maybe 2 or 3 opposing Allied forces in Sicily at that time.
It's just immense numbers.
When you look at the total losses, estimates suggest Germany suffered around 80% of its total military deaths on the Eastern Front alone. The Soviet Union ultimately drove the Axis forces back through Eastern Europe all the way to Berlin.
So the war ends, the Allies are victorious. But the political outcome for the big three leaders, Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin, was wildly divergent.
Completely different trajectories. Roosevelt died just before victory was fully secured. Churchill found himself leading a victorious but effectively bankrupted Britain, and he was already deeply fearful of Soviet post-war expansion. Stalin, conversely, emerged stronger than ever domestically, despite the horrific cost. He secured his primary goal, Soviet dominance over Eastern Europe, and he gained specific territorial prizes agreed upon with the Allies, particularly in the Pacific, like the Sakhalin Islands from Japan.
So Churchill felt Stalin got everything he wanted.
Yeah, Churchill, according to sources, bitterly felt that Stalin was really the only one of the 3 national leaders who emerged from the gigantic struggle with pretty much exactly what he wanted strategically.
Okay, so the end of that hot war, World War II, quickly transitioned into something else. The Cold War. A new kind of global geopolitical rivalry that would define the next, 45 years?
Pretty much, yeah. This was a systemic confrontation between the U.S.-led capitalist Western Bloc and the USSR-led communist Eastern Bloc. It's defined not by direct major conflict between the 2 superpowers, thankfully, but by proxy wars fought across the globe.
Right. Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan.
Exactly. Plus, an unrelenting conventional and nuclear arms race, pervasive espionage, intensive propaganda battles, and these high-profile technological competitions like the space race. We generally mark its start with the Truman Doctrine in March 1947, pledging U.S. support against communist expansion.
And its end.
Its end is generally considered the dissolution of the Soviet Union itself in December 1991.
Now, the U.S. response to rising Soviet power after the war was immediate, and it was economic as well as strategic.
Absolutely. The U.S. enacted the Marshall Plan in June 1947. This was a truly massive undertaking. It pledged over $13 billion, which is equivalent to roughly $189 billion today, in economic assistance to Western European countries.
Why so much focus on economics?
Well, the aid was crucial, not just for rebuilding war-devastated economies, which was vital in itself, but it was also about strengthening the Western Bloc against internal communist threats. Strong communist parties existed in France and Italy, for example, and it countered Soviet external pressure. The stark contrast between Western recovery fueled by American aid and Soviet-imposed austerity in the East became a key propaganda tool throughout the Cold War.
Right. Now, after Stalin's death in 1953, there was a power struggle, and the political baton eventually passed to Nikita Khrushchev. This signaled a brief but really important thaw in the system.
Yeah, Khrushchev eventually won that struggle, largely by outmaneuvering his rivals like Malenkov and Beria within the Presidium, the top party body. His famous 1956 secret speech delivered to the 20th Party Congress, where he denounced Stalin's cult of personality and his crimes. That was a bombshell.
It must have been.
It initiated the period of de-Stalinization. This brought a noticeable easing of societal controls, release of some political prisoners, and a slight liberalization of culture things you could publish or discuss. It's often called the Khrushchev Thaw.
But it wasn't all smooth sailing for him.
No. Although he earned some political victories at home, his relations with the other great communist power, Mao's China, soured significantly during this time. Ideological disputes, border issues. It led to the lasting Sino-Soviet split, fracturing the communist world.
And technologically, Khrushchev's era saw this massive triumph that absolutely stunned the West.
Sputnik. October 4th, 1957. The Soviet Union launches Sputnik 1, the first man-made satellite to successfully orbit the Earth. It was a massive public relations coup, a huge scientific achievement.
And a shock to the system in the U.S.
A huge shock. It was seen as undeniable proof of Soviet technological prowess, especially in rocketry. And it came right in the context of the space race, which was itself intrinsically linked to the arms race. If they could put a satellite in orbit.
They could put a nuclear warhead on an intercontinental ballistic missile, an ICBM.
Precisely. The American reaction was immediate, the Sputnik crisis. It led directly to massive U.S. investment in science education, the creation of NASA, and a huge acceleration of the U.S. missile program. Fear of a missile gap dominated defense thinking for years.
Yet, this era of heightened competition also brought the world terrifyingly close to nuclear war, the closest it ever came.
The Cuban Missile Crisis. October-November 1962. It remains the single moment when the world arguably stood closest to nuclear annihilation, when U.S. reconnaissance discovered the Soviets were secretly installing medium and intermediate-range nuclear missiles in Cuba.
Missiles capable of hitting major U.S. cities within minutes.
Exactly. President Kennedy responded not with an immediate invasion, which some advisors urged, but with a naval quarantine, effectively a blockade of Cuba, demanding the missiles be removed. It was an incredibly tense standoff.
And Khrushchev backed down.
Ultimately, yes. Khrushchev backed down. He agreed to remove the missiles from Cuba. But crucially, this wasn't unconditional. It was in exchange for a public U.S. pledge not to invade Cuba again, which was important for Castro, and, significantly, a highly secret side deal to remove U.S. Jupiter missiles from Turkey, which were similarly close to the Soviet Union.
Ah, the secret deal. That part isn't always highlighted.
No, but it was key to Khrushchev saving face. The horrifying experience of being on the brink spurred serious early arms control efforts, things like the Limited Test Ban Treaty shortly after, and it reinforced the need for direct communication leading to the Moscow-Washington hotline.
Right. Now, Khrushchev's reforms, his thaw, they were eventually reversed. He was ousted in 1964. The next long era, under Leonid Brezhnev, became known as the era of stagnation, marked by a return to a more hardline foreign policy.
Brezhnev came to power in '64 and pretty quickly returned to a more centralized, security-focused, almost neo-Stalinist understanding of international affairs. This led to escalating conflicts and interventions. The most famous or infamous application of this hardline approach was the Brezhnev Doctrine, articulated in 1968.
What prompted that?
It was prompted by the reforms happening in Czechoslovakia, the Prague Spring, which Moscow feared were threatening Soviet-style socialism itself. The doctrine essentially stated that any threat to socialist power in one socialist country was the concern of all socialist countries and should be combated collectively. Basically, what we have, we hold. No deviations allowed.
And the result?
The result was the invasion of Czechoslovakia by Warsaw Pact troops in August 1968, crushing the reforms and signaling very clearly the end of any real autonomy within the Eastern Bloc. Moscow called the shots.
This tendency toward escalation, toward intervention to maintain control, it ultimately culminated in the costly and draining Soviet-Afghan War.
Yes, the intervention began in December 1979. The initial Soviet plan, looking back, seems incredibly ambitious and naive. They expected a quick stabilization of the pro-Soviet Afghan government, which was crumbling, and then a withdrawal within maybe a year.
That didn't happen.
Not even close. They immediately met fierce, determined, decentralized resistance from Afghan Mujahideen guerrillas. These groups quickly received support arms, funding, training from the US, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, China, and others who saw a chance to bleed the Soviets.
The proxy war.
A major proxy war. The Soviet military presence swelled significantly, reaching approximately 115,000 troops by the mid-1980s, bogged down in a brutal counterinsurgency war.
Why did the Soviets commit to such disastrous decade-long quagmire in the first place? It seems like such a miscalculation.
There were multiple compounding reasons. The grave deterioration of the communist Afghan government they supported was central. They feared its collapse. There was also genuine fear in Moscow that Islamic fanaticism, potentially spreading from the recent Iranian revolution next door, could spill over and destabilize the Soviet Central Asian republics, which had large Muslim populations.
Okay, internal security fears.
Yes. And furthermore, the Soviet leadership perceived that the period of détente with the U.S. was breaking down anyway, marked by U.S. military buildup under Carter and then Reagan and harsher rhetoric. They might have felt this was an opportunity or perhaps a necessity to solidify their southern border while the U.S. was preoccupied.
How did the Soviets actually fight that war, given the difficult terrain and the guerrilla opposition? It wasn't conventional warfare.
No, they struggled immensely with conventional tactics against decentralized guerrillas who knew the terrain. So they increasingly relied on harsh tactics, heavy firepower, intimidation, destroying villages, livestock, and crops in areas suspected of supporting the resistance, trying to depopulate the countryside.
Scorched earth again.
In many ways, yes. They used large-scale military forays, search-and-destroy operations. And the Mi-24 helicopter gunship, the Hind, became this iconic and terrifying weapon used extensively to suppress the population and hunt mujahideen. But ultimately, the war became a huge drain, militarily, economically, politically, and psychologically on the Soviet system, their own Vietnam.
And it was the next leader, the reformist Mikhail Gorbachev, who finally recognized the immense cost and decided to end the intervention.
Yes. Gorbachev came to power in 1985, and he quickly recognized the war was unwinnable and was absolutely exhausting the already struggling Soviet system. He announced the decision to withdraw, and the process began. The last Soviet column officially crossed back into the Uzbek SSR on February 15, 1989.
But the fighting didn't stop then.
No, it's important to note the Soviet-backed Afghan government, under Najibullah, continued fighting the Mujahideen alone for several more years. It only collapsed entirely after the Soviet Union itself dissolved in late 1991, and all external support from Moscow was officially cut off. The withdrawal ended Soviet involvement, but not the Afghan Civil War.
Right, so that brings us directly to Mikhail Gorbachev, the man who attempted to modernize and, in his view, save Soviet communism, but instead presided over its rapid and complete demise.
Yeah, Gorbachev's intent was definitely reform, not dissolution. His efforts were guided by two key concepts you hear a lot. Perestroika, meaning restructuring, which aimed at economic modernization, introducing some market mechanisms.
And Glasnost.
And Glasnost, meaning openness, which was designed to facilitate public access to information, reduce censorship, allow more debate. The deep irony is that these social reforms, particularly Glasnost, had massive, completely unintended consequences that actually accelerated the collapse.
How did Glasnost openness actually help dismantle the state? That seems counterintuitive.
Well, Glasnost immediately allowed decades of long-suppressed ethnic tensions and nationalist feelings to just surge to the surface. Constituent republics, especially the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Georgia, Moldova, Ukraine, began openly demanding greater autonomy, sovereignty, or outright independence. Things that were unthinkable to even whisper before were now being debated openly.
And the economic reforms, Perestroika.
They were insufficient, often contradictory, and poorly implemented. The Soviet planned economy, already suffering from deep structural problems, outdated infrastructure, rampant corruption, just couldn't cope. It basically collapsed under the weight of these half-hearted reforms. People experienced hyperinflation, constant shortages of basic goods, store shelves were famously empty.
Which must have destroyed public faith.
Absolutely. It created massive public cynicism and eroded any remaining willingness among the general population to fight for the survival of the Soviet system. Why defend a system that can't even provide soap or sausage?
Meanwhile, externally, Gorbachev was seeking a radical end to the Cold War, particularly the crippling arms race.
He was desperate to lighten the huge burden defense spending placed on the struggling Soviet economy. And crucially, he managed to develop a genuine personal relationship with U.S. President Ronald Reagan.
Reagan, who had famously called the USSR the evil empire.
The very same. But Reagan apparently came to see in Mikhail Gorbachev, as he put it, somebody he could do business with. This personal chemistry, combined with Gorbachev's clear desire for deals, allowed for groundbreaking discussions and treaties on reducing nuclear arsenals, effectively winding down the global confrontation far faster than almost anyone had predicted just years earlier.
So the end of the Soviet Union itself came quickly and quite dramatically between 1989 and 1991.
Incredibly fast looking back, the revolutions of 1989 saw the USSR lose all its Eastern European satellite states. Poland, Hungary, East Germany falling with the Berlin Wall, Czechoslovakia, Romania, Bulgaria, all went their own way, and Moscow basically let them go without intervening militarily. A huge shift.
And domestically.
Domestically, the March 1989 election for the new Congress of People's Deputies was a real shock to the system. Voters, even when faced with only one official communist candidate, crossed off numerous high-profile names in protest, signaling the party's massive loss of legitimacy.
And the final nail in the coffin.
The final fatal act was the August coup in 1991. This was an attempted takeover by hardliners within the Communist Party, the KGB, and the military. They put Gorbachev under house arrest and tried to seize control in Moscow. Their goal was to reverse all of Gorbachev's liberalizing reforms and crush the independence movements in the republics.
But the coup failed spectacularly.
It collapsed after just 3 days, partly due to public resistance in Moscow, led by the charismatic president of the Russian Republic, Boris Yeltsin, who famously stood on a tank. But the failure of the coup killed the USSR, even though Gorbachev was restored briefly. When the coup collapsed, the power of Boris Yeltsin soared. He was seen as the hero who stood up to the hardliners. The balance of power decisively tipped away from the central Soviet government to the leaders of the constituent republics. Latvia and Estonia immediately declared the restoration of their full independence, followed by others.
And Gorbachev.
Gorbachev found himself president of a country that was ceasing to exist. He resigned as general secretary of the Communist Party. Its activities were suspended. By December 1991, the leaders of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus met and declared the Soviet Union dissolved. Gorbachev formally resigned as Soviet president on Christmas Day 1991. The flag came down. It was over.
The transition to the new Russian Federation under Yeltsin was tumultuous, to say the least, marked by chaos, economic shock therapy.
The 1990s were incredibly difficult for most Russians. Shock therapy led to hyperinflation, wiping out savings. Mass privatization often benefited insiders, creating oligarchs overnight, and living standards plummeted for many. The Russian armed forces, formed in 1992, inherited about 85% of the massive Soviet military machine. But resources were scarce, morale was rock bottom, and competence was often lacking.
Which was evident in Chechnya.
Tragically evident in the disastrous and poorly executed First Chechen War from 1994-96. Political legitimacy was also fractured. Yeltsin's narrow 1996 re-election against the communist Gennady Zyuganov was widely seen as flawed, even denounced as fraudulent by some foreign observers, amidst concerns about media bias and oligarchic influence.
But by the late 90s, there was a shift in foreign policy thinking, wasn't there? The Primakov Doctrine signaled that Russia was perhaps starting to recover its great power ambition.
Yes, exactly. This doctrine, named after the then foreign minister Yevgeny Primakov, signaled a decisive return to foreign policy realism. It was an explicit recognition that Russia needed to actively counter American unipolar hegemony, which seemed dominant after the Soviet collapse.
What did that look like in practice?
The shift focused internally on strengthening the Commonwealth of Independent States, CIS, the loose grouping of former Soviet republics trying to maintain Russian influence there. And externally, Primakov advocated for a strategic triangle, a Moscow-Delhi-Beijing axis. Not a formal alliance, but a flexible geopolitical formation aimed specifically at balancing U.S. influence and pushing back against things like NATO expansion eastward. This return to explicit great power thinking really laid the ideological foundation for the next era.
Which, of course, is the era of Putinism, beginning when Vladimir Putin became first acting president on New Year's Eve 1999, and then elected president in 2000.
Right. And the early Putin years, roughly 2000 to 2008 or so, provided the necessary economic foundation for political resurgence. Thanks largely to soaring global prices for oil and gas, Russia's main exports, the economy boomed. GDP grew by something like 85% over that period.
And that allowed Putin to.
It allowed him to stabilize the nation after the chaos of the 90s, pay back wages and pensions, reassert central control over regions and oligarchs, and begin funding military modernization. began. It restored a sense of order and predictability that many Russians craved.
Now, the core philosophy, or perhaps the animating grievance, of Putin's rule is often encapsulated in a famous quote he made about the Soviet collapse.
Yes, in his 2005 State of the Nation address, Putin called the dissolution of the Soviet Union the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the century. Now, this wasn't just historical commentary. It was a clear political message aimed squarely at the Russian constituency.
What was the message?
It was promoting a narrative of national humiliation, the need for great power resurgence, justifying the re-centralization of power, and hinting at Russian interests in the former Soviet space, a kind of irredentism. This sentiment underpins much of the ideology we now call Putinism.
Okay, let's try to synthesize the defining features of this system, which analysts often describe using terms like authoritarian state capitalism or managed democracy. What are the key characteristics?
Analysts usually highlight several key features. First, political control is absolutely paramount. We see dramatically strengthened presidential power compared to Yeltsin's often chaotic federation. This power relies heavily, crucially, on the Siloviki.
We need to define Siloviki clearly for our listeners. They're more than just security veterans, right?
That's right. It's a really important concept. Siloviki translates roughly as people of force. They are political figures, often very high-ranking, who have backgrounds in the security services, like the KGB and its successor, the FSB, the military or intelligence agencies.
And their mindset influences governance.
Profoundly. Their mentality is typically highly centralized, deeply suspicious of foreign influence, nationalistic, and steeped in the discipline and secrecy of the intelligence apparatus. Their prominence in government and state-owned corporations fundamentally alters the nature of governance, prioritizing state security, stability, and control over, say, liberal democratic processes or civilian political mechanisms. Governance itself often operates in what's called a manual control mode, direct intervention from the top, bypassing weaker technical government bodies or formal procedures.
Okay, so strong central control via security elites. What's the second feature?
Second, relatedly, is the approach to justice and wealth. The system often seems to operate on a selective application of justice, embodying the cynical principle attributed sometimes to Franco, everything is for the friends, the law is for the enemies. We saw high-profile cases against oligarchs who challenged Putin early on, like Khodorkovsky.
And wealth inequality.
This has created staggering income inequality. Sources note that for a time, Russia had more billionaires per capita than almost anywhere else, certainly more than the rest of Europe combined. Simultaneously, the state has systematically restored control over key economic sectors that were privatized in the 90s, especially energy. State control over the vital oil sector, for instance, reportedly increased from about 16% in 2003 to over 33% just 2 years later, giving the central leadership enormous economic leverage domestically and internationally.
And ideologically. The system seems to be actively crafting a new national narrative, distinct from both Tsarism and communism, though drawing on both.
Yes. The ideology and history component is crucial. It involves promoting a kind of conservative religious traditionalism, particularly leaning on the Orthodox Church, as a bulwark against perceived Western moral decadence, things like same-sex marriage, liberal individualism, radical feminism.
And this idea of Eurasianism.
Right. There's a strong focus on Eurasianism, the idea that Russia is not really part of Europe nor fully Asia, but a unique standalone civilization with its own distinct historical path and values. Furthermore, while there's definitely a nostalgia cultivated for Soviet power and stability, Putin himself engages in significant historical revisionism. He explicitly blames Lenin, for example, for his policies toward national minorities and federal structure, arguing they planted time bombs that destabilized and ultimately led to the collapse of historical Russia.
Interesting. So finally, how does this core ideology translate into modern Russian foreign policy?
Foreign policy under Putinism is defined by, firstly, a clear nostalgia for the pre-1989 global status, the idea of competing with the U.S. on a global scale as an equal superpower. Secondly, energy is explicitly used as an instrument of international politics, what analysts call pipeline diplomacy, to exert influence over neighbors and key European customers. Thirdly, Russia actively seeks to reassert what it sees as its rightful sphere of influence, often drawing on Tsarist ideas of historical territories or protecting Russian speakers abroad. And crucially, it views international organizations, particularly its permanent seat and veto power on the UN Security Council, not primarily as instruments of multilateral cooperation, but as vital tools of national power. Tools to ensure Russia has a say, a veto, on all major geopolitical issues and can block actions it opposes. It's about asserting sovereignty and multipolarity against perceived U.S. dominance. Hashtag tag outro.
Well, okay. Looking back over this immense chronicle we've just raced through, from the splintered Russ's princedoms under the Mongol yoke, through the Tsarist autocracy, the Soviet experiment, right up to the centralized security state of modern Moscow, the continuity of certain themes is indeed striking.
It really is. You trace a clear, deep-seated pattern, a reliance on highly centralized power. Whether it's Ivan the Terrible crushing the boyars, Peter the Great forcing Westernization, Stalin purging the Bolshevik elite, or modern leaders relying so heavily on the Siloviki.
And that centralization always seems linked to conflict.
It seems intrinsically linked to this continuous struggle against, and often deep suspicion of, outside forces. Whether that perceived threat was the Mongols, Napoleon, the capitalist West during the Cold War, or NATO expansion today. This sense of encirclement or external pressure seems to fuel the internal drive for unity and control.
And we connect this to the bigger picture. You mentioned earlier that data confirms historical trauma, especially the mass repression of the Stalin era, still exerts an enduring impact on political behavior today.
Yes, the echoes of historical memory, both genuine and manipulated, are profoundly real. Modern Russian policy, often driven by these themes of irredentism, reclaiming lost influence or status, combined with historical revisionism and this determined desire to restore Russia as an undeniable global great power, is deeply colored by these historical experiences, wounds, and the narratives constructed around them.
So as you, our listener, reflect on this massive timeline, perhaps consider this final provocative thought. How much does Russia's deeply ingrained political culture, this recurring pattern of centralized, often personalized power that tends to crush domestic political opposition and periodically replace one elite with a new, theoretically more loyal one through systemic purges or shakeups, how much does that culture itself limit the possibility of any meaningful organic political evolution away from autocracy, regardless of internal economic demands or external geopolitical pressures? Is the pattern too strong?